Let's take a look at a quick video about flipped learning on flipped learning. So the idea is this video, you'll watch it before you come to the large group session where we're actually using the software. So the objectives for the whole workshop will be for you to identify what the components of flipped learning are. You'll create an outline and then you'll create a sample recording and share it with your peers if you're brave. You don't have to, but if you're brave, you can. So let's discover what you already know about flipped learning. You probably know that the idea of flipped learning is not brand new. It's been around for a while, and it has essentially reversed the order of instruction, where in the old days we used to have large group instruction with a lecture and then homework activities after. Now the lecture, although I'd like to get rid of that word and use a presentation instead. So a presentation occurs first, and usually that's at home, asynchronous or at the student's own time, and then a large group classroom activity takes place. So there's an organization, flippedlearning.org, where you can go to get more information, but essentially this graphic is a summary of what it is, and that's flexible. There is a learning culture associated with it. There's intentional content. It's not just regurgitation of lectures without thinking purposefully about what goes in there. And of course, there are professional educators. So what does flipped learning look like? In this picture, which was taken from Stanford, this is a sample of what students are doing. They're engaged, they're looking at their computers, they're having discussions with each other. They're usually solving a problem, and then there may be some, if you can see in the background, there are students drawing diagrams, different things going on. It can look a little chaotic. There's a link here that you can go to for more information. This is what it doesn't look like. Our traditional lecture where students are disengaged and kind of bored. So in the previous workshop that we did, we discussed this and what is it about this generation and all those traditional questions you've been asking yourself. Take a minute, if you can, pause the video and think about the media that's consumed by students and the types of information that they're used to receiving, and then sort of compare that to a lecture where that's very different from the types of information they're used to getting quickly, lots of different ways. So who's doing flipped learning? Well, Stanford and Yale and Georgetown, UVA, and you know what? If you Google it, guess who's at the top of the list? Yep, that's EVMS. So here's a sample of Khan Academy, where if you go to this link, you can actually watch a video where it's narrated drawing. And so they're explaining a system and they're going through a process where they're drawing. This started, Sal Khan started this concept and has been working with Charles Prober at Stanford University to bring flipped learning to medical education. So how does it work? I guess we've all talked about Bloom's taxonomy. I hope that that you know what that is. But if you look at the levels of learning from lower to higher here, higher going down, remembering is a pretty low level of learning. Usually happens in face-to-face lecture with traditional classrooms. In a flipped classroom, the remember part is pre-recorded. Or it can be reading, podcasts, websites, whatever you want to do. It's done before. To move up the taxonomy to the next level of understand, there can be question and answer in a traditional classroom. In a flipped classroom, there can be reflections, peer-to-peer discussions, collaboration. So you can get an idea. As you move up, you can move all the way up to student projects and presentations. It used to be in traditional homework, may have happened, I don't know if your undergraduate experience, it was way different than the students coming in, but there could have been homework or there could have been nothing done after the traditional classroom. Now this part where student projects and presentations are required, or can be required, that allows the student to move up the level of learning in Bloom's taxonomy. So what's the science behind flipped learning? I'm not going to go down the dissertation hole with you, but essentially it's all about cognition. And if you think of a schema like a way to organize information in your brain, there's a limited pipeline in your working memory. And it can be the research that goes between 4 and 7 pieces of information. But what happens is you automate and you get better at the pieces of information. They become easier to remember. For example, if you look at 757, if you're from here, you know that that's an area code in Eastern Virginia. That if you work at EVMS, you know that 446 is a prefix, or way back in the day, that used to be a switch number and it was static. So some of you guys might be old enough to remember that a 446 prefix meant it was in a specific geographic area. And that doesn't no longer happens, and boy, I'm really going down the rabbit hole. But these are chunks of information, and this is my phone number, 5247 at work. So this is a line number, and you know, if you work EVMS on campus, you don't need to remember this because you know you're in Virginia. You don't need to remember this because you know you're at EVMS. You just need to remember this. But all of this is sort of implied in that number. And this is like automaticity of expertise, where you get really good at something, it becomes automatic. It sort of becomes more compactly held in your brain in a schema. And when you bring this up, it's one whole piece of information. Whereas if a novice brings it up, it could be 40,000 pieces of information. So if you can only bring up 4 to 7 pieces of information or chunks of information at a time in your working memory, as an expert, your piece that you bring up from your long-term memory is a lot heftier and compact than the unwieldy separate pieces of information that a novice hasn't put together. Okay, I promised I wouldn't go on and on. Essentially, the research about flipped learning can include things like cognitive load, where I've given you the resource for the article from Sweller and Van Marion, Boer and Paz, where the research on cognitive load divides the load on thinking or cognition into 3 different parts. There's intrinsic, which is essentially how hard a subject is. There's extraneous, which is all the extra crazy stuff that sometimes we make learners go through, like bells and whistles and extra buttons on an interface. And then there's germane processing, which is what's left over after intrinsic and extraneous takes up resources. What's left over is for germane processing. So intrinsic load can be controlled by segmenting and sequencing properly, that you can break the more complex information down into parts and put the parts in the right order. And the measurement for intrinsic load is how much element interactivity, or how many different things do you need to hold in your understanding at one time to understand a subject. Whereas if you are thinking about anatomy, if you have anatomy is a lot of rote memorization, where you have action, insertion, origin, and you have nerves and vasculature and things like that. But if you talk about injury to a specific area in anatomy, now you're holding all of those things together and sort of imagining, well, if the injury happened this way, what happened to this muscle and where was the force, and all of those things come into play. So intrinsic load is how many different things you have to think about at the same time. Let's look at multimedia effects. Mayer and Moreno did a great job of writing this article, 9 Ways to Reduce Cognitive Load in Multimedia. Multimedia can be things like what you're looking at right now and PowerPoint. So the contiguity principle in the old days, old textbooks used to have like a legend here and then labels here. Now, it takes less cognition, research says, and this kind of makes sense, to put the actual word on the place labeling the item instead of, oh, that's this load. All right. The modality principle is there are different ways or modalities to present. Some of them take less cognition than others. So I could be explaining to you blood flow through the heart, and as you can see, I'm not a subject matter expert. I won't even pretend to know this. I'm an educational expert. But as I'm explaining that this ventricle and etc. happens, you're sort of imagining the reality of blood flow and movement instead of looking at the um, arrows and thinking that way. It's not a bad way to use. What I'm doing is narrating over top of a narrating and annotating right here, where I'm saying, okay, this part's really important because if this gets blocked, we get in trouble. So you can, as a learner, you can imagine that's pretty easy to understand. What happens when you use something like a video, if you look at this video, it is a narrated animation of how the circulatory system works. A lot easier to understand because the movement and the color is happening instead of explaining. Here's the worst way to do it, where you have redundancy. And especially if you're in PowerPoint and you're reading over top of word for word, this is torture for everyone. So imagine I'm going to do this to you. Oxygen-rich blood, red blood, then enters the left side of the heart, composed of the left atrium and ventricle. I want you to notice while I was reading that, where are your eyes going? Your eyes are probably going over here to find the area I'm talking about, then coming back, and you read so much faster than I can narrate it to you. So you're going ahead here, you're looking over here, you're coming back to see where I am narrating, you're saying, man, I wish she would talk a little bit faster. And there's a lot of cognition lost in this process. So don't do this. You can either voice narrate over top of images, or you can have an actual moving picture where you're having an animation. So some examples of in-class learning activities like team-based learning, case-based learning, we use these all the time. And there's a link down at the bottom for standardized vocabulary for AAMC for undergraduate medical education. All of these activities can include flipped learning in them. It just depends on where you're going to utilize the information. Most flipped learning, there's a recorded presentation that's viewed outside, and then there's some activity that comes in, and almost all of these from here up are done in large group, and then from here down are done in small groups. The big buzz in LCME is for self-directed learning. There are 5 parts to self-directed learning where the students have to take the initiative for their own learning, where they are doing things like diagnosing and formulating their goals, identifying their own resources, implementing activities to learn, and evaluating the outcomes. What it is not is independent learning, which it can be flipped learning where you're just looking at things outside, or independent study where you're given resources and you go away. The big differentiation for me is this part where they diagnose what they need to learn and they formulate their own goals, which means to me as an instructional designer, they're writing their own objectives. So here's some examples with using Camtasia. I'll include these links so you can actually go and look. This is a video of a pathology slide where it's annotated, it's moving, and there's voice narration over top. And we'll look at these in the regular classroom too. This is a Khan Academy video from Stanford where there's annotation and drawing and narration over top, and I'll include that link for you to look at your leisure. And then there's some examples using Articulate, which is a piece of software where you can create branching and decision making. So going back to Camtasia, that pretty much just records what you're doing on the screen with your voice. And same thing here. But Articulate can do both. It can both record what's going on in the screen, and you can create decision making and clicking so students can go through and make decisions about, like in this example, which part of the diagram do they want to learn about first. So I'll leave you with this story. When I was growing up, my family car was a 1967 GTO. This explains a lot about how I'm not so normal. So when we were growing up, my dad would take us, my brother and I, away from my mother on the Saturdays to give her some peace. And we would take this family car to the car wash. And we would sit in the car and he would spray the windows and make us squeal. And it was great fun. And then we would get in the car and start driving away. One day I started to notice that we were a little bit different than other families, you know? And I noticed that other families were drying their normal cars off with rags or cloths, and we did not dry our car. So I had to ask Dad, why do we not dry our car off with a towel like other people? And he said, oh, if your car is fast enough, you don't need to dry it off with a rag. Our next stop would be the highway, where way back in the day, the on-ramp to 264 was included a toll, a dime toll, where you would drive up. There would be a red light, no gate, because this was way back in the day in the 60s. So we'd drive up to the toll on-ramp, and you throw a dime in, and the light would turn green, and then you could go. Well, you know, we had to ask Dad, what happens when you don't put a dime in or when you outrun the light? And he says, oh, well, a pit of alligators opens up and the alligators pick the meat off the flesh of your bones. Well, you know, I was, 6 years old and pretty much knowledgeable about the world and my dad, and knew that this was not really true. But my brother, who was 4, wasn't quite sure if the pit of alligators was real. So one day we go to the car wash. He's been working on the engine, so he wants to check the timing. And we get up to the on-ramp. He throws the dime in, and he jams on the accelerator. And now we're squealing with delight until we pass the red light, still turned red light, and the alarm goes off. Now my father is ecstatic because he knows he's gotten the timing right, and this car really has off the line now, and we're all good. But my brother is screaming in the back seat, Dad, the pit of alligators, they're going to get us and pick the meat off our bones. And my dad has to pull over and calm him down. I tell him that's not really real. So the moral of the story is, when you go to do Camtasia, or you go to use Articulate Storyline and create your first flipped learning experience, there is no pit of alligators. You're in this workshop, you're using our machines, and if you touch a button and things don't work right, there's no large pit of alligators that's going to open up, and no terrible things are going to happen. And if things get all messed up, there are people here to help you get them back in order. So that's the pit of alligators moral of the story for you. Be brave, go forward, and practice flip learning in style. Here are some resources and a link where you can get this attachment to different journal articles. Here are the resources for this presentation, and I hope to see you in class soon. Thank you very much.